The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents I Do Not Believe versus I Am Not Convinced. Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. For those who don't know, in addition to the video content that I do here at the Atheist Debates project and my work in the past at the Atheist Experience and currently on the line on my various shows, I also keep and breed reptiles. And I will say that for anybody who's irritated at infighting and bickering within the secular community, the atheist community, the freethinker community, or even just the arguments about which label you should use, you should know that those same issues exist everywhere and seemingly in every community that I've ever been even roughly associated with. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe it's me being there. But in reality, when you take a look around at the reptile community, these are people who are incredibly passionate about animals. Some of them more so than others. For some of them, it's more of a flipper business type thing, where they're not necessarily doing the right thing for the animals. But there's a lot of arguments that take place about what's best for the animals, right down to whether we should be keeping animals at all, which is not something I'm going to get into today. But one of the most common things that comes up is either actual attempts at a naturalistic fallacy or accusations that something is in fact a naturalistic fallacy. Naturalistic fallacy is merely saying that because something is natural or occurs naturally, that is the preferred or better scenario. And so, for example, when it comes to reptile lighting, there are tons of websites and discussion groups and scientists talking about reptile lighting. For years, they would say, oh, LED UVB is a myth. And then we got LED UVBs. Don't start sending in your hate mail. I understand that the LED UVBs that we currently have are potentially not good enough. They're generally not recommended because they do not carry the full spectrum of UVB lighting that we detect from the sun. The problem is that may not be a problem. So for a lot of reptiles, what you're trying to do is you're trying to counter metabolic bone disease and other health conditions that result from the ability to process calcium and things like that. And it's very easy to say, let's just emulate sunlight. But sunlight is also harmful. It contributes to skin cancer in humans. It's, not the same thing with reptiles. We're different creatures. But it is also potentially harsh and harmful. The fact that we can provide a perhaps better existence synthetically than we could naturalistically is already known. If I have an animal, I'm taking it to vet. I'm giving it health care. I am keeping it safe from predators. All sorts of things. There's a reason why, for example, the various geckos and skinks that we have want to interact with us or seem to want to interact with us, whereas in the wild, they might just stay away from us. And it's because there are instincts and there are things that are learned. In a recent discussion, someone was talking about whether or not we should use top open enclosures or front open enclosures. And somebody pointed out correctly that if the goal is to provide the least amount of anxiety and stress to the animals, front open enclosures are going to be preferable for many species, if not most species, because the top-down enclosure feels like predation. When your hand's coming in from the top, your top down, it's kind of there's going to be a reaction that's closer to, hang on, what's going on? Am I getting squished? Am I going to be, eaten? Whereas if you have a front open enclosure, and you can allow the animal to come out to approach you come in, even. It's kind of like a handshake versus standing over someone with your hands on their shoulder, that kind of difference. But someone has suggested that raw fact about animal psychology, and another person tried to suggest that they were using a naturalistic fallacy. and then said, these animals are raised in captivity. Why would they be worried about predation at all? Demonstrating that not only do they not understand the naturalistic fallacy, but they also don't understand that instinct is real and doesn't go away merely because something was bred in captivity and never had to be out in the wild. Now, there are changes that can occur over generations. Early ball pythons didn't eat particularly well. Now they eat a lot better than they used to. And it's because these are the offspring that were produced by the ones that were willing to eat in captivity. And so that sort of instinctiveness was transferred. So they fell into an error about nature versus nurture, and they fell into an error of this is what this other person is saying. They're making this claim. But they weren't. They were just making a factual statement about the psychology of animals and what some prefer versus what may or may not be a better idea. Trying to spin it as if they were saying, you must do this or you're doing it wrong, is a big mistake when we're just talking about preference and possible best standards. So I hear you. What does this have to do with religion and religious discussions? I'm so glad you asked that. It is incredibly difficult to recognize fallacies in conversational topics, especially when we are invested in those ideas. In the same way that reptile keepers are passionate about not being wrong, not being accused of being wrong, making sure we're doing the right thing for the animals, and we're going to bump heads with people on occasion. The same thing happens in discussions about anything that is a cherished, held belief or something that is important and significant to that individual. And so we should all be striving to exercise precision whenever possible in addressing what was actually said, with charitability whenever possible, but not so much charitability that you respin their position into something it isn't. This comes up quite often on the call-in shows, because if I say, I don't have a good reason to believe in a God, there are people who assume that's me saying, I have concluded that there is no God. And those are different things. And this happens constantly. For example, if you were to say, I don't have a good reason to believe in a God, therefore gods don't exist, that would be fallacious. It is simply not true that your lack of belief or your lack of seeing good reasons has any bearing on whether or not a God actually exists. It only has a bearing on whether or not you have a warranted belief. There's some common examples of a particular fallacy known as affirming the consequent. And that is, if it's raining, I'm wet. I'm wet, therefore it's raining. No, that's a fallacy. You could be wet because you were standing in the shower. You could be wet because you just walked out of the pool. Rain is one of the things that might result in you being wet. But also, it's not even the case that if it's raining, I'm wet. It could be raining and you could be indoors. So if it's raining, I am wet. The fact that I'm wet doesn't tell you at all whether or not it's raining. There is an exception, and that is if it was written this way, if and only if it is raining, I am wet. Then I am wet means that in fact it's raining. Now, you can just reject that first premise, but from a structural standpoint, that argument is at least valid. And it's a similar mistake if you were to say, if there's good reason to believe in God, then I'd believe it. I don't believe it, therefore there's not good reason to believe in God. That is exactly the same wrong fallacy. It is why I spend a good deal of time kind of correcting other atheists that kind of overstate the case. It's one thing to say we don't have sufficient reason to believe, and it's another to say we have sufficient reason to believe this is false. In addition to the affirming the consequent fallacy, I'd be wary of the fallacy, which is if an argument is fallacious, people then reach the conclusion that the conclusion of the argument is false. That's not true. If an argument is fallacious, it means the conclusion cannot be assessed to determine if it's true or false on its own. This happens over and over again. These affirming the consequent and then the fallacy, they happen over and over again in conversation. Because I'll say something like, I don't believe that. And they will assume that this statement is equivalent to, I believe that statement is false. When in reality, it's equivalent to, I am not convinced. Or even better, I am not yet convinced. There's a reason that people think like this is because we're not trained to think precisely and logically unless we've actually taken courses in language and or logic and precision of language and identifying fallacies. And so colloquially, we might say, I don't believe it's raining. And that colloquially means I'm pretty sure it's not raining. So saying I don't believe X in common parlance often gives the impression very strongly and intentionally that you are actually saying X is not true. When you say, I don't believe she's coming to the party, okay, depending on how you phrase that, you could be like, I don't believe she's coming to the party, in which case you're being sarcastic and you're like, oh, she's coming to the party, but I'm aghast. But if somebody says, hey, is Jane coming to the party? And you say, I don't believe so. The implication there is that you're saying, I'm pretty sure she's not coming to the party. I'm not convinced she's coming. I'm not convinced it's raining. Takes on a different tone and a different implication than I don't believe she's coming or I don't believe it's raining. There is a difference. Belief is the result of becoming convinced. And for me, when I say I believe, I am saying I am convinced that X is the case. It's primarily a problem, to my understanding, with English. I don't know how difficult this is in other languages because I'm a stupid American that barely speaks the language that I grew up with and bits and pieces of a couple others that might allow me to find a bathroom. But if I'm not convinced of something, that feels different than saying, I don't believe that. And it's in part because we take these things personally. Like if you say, I don't believe you, oftentimes you're implying, I think you're lying. I think you are deceptive. And because that becomes very personal, the term belief carries baggage that doesn't exist with the term convinced. Now, I'm not in any way arguing to throw out the word believe. I am fine with it. I think it's a perfectly acceptable word, and when it's used properly and understood properly, there's no issue. That's true for anything. What I am saying is that if you find that you say, I don't believe something, and the person you're talking to is assuming you're saying it's false, or if you say, I don't believe you, or I don't believe that, and they assume that you're asserting that they're lying, it might be useful to change the language you're using and say, I am not convinced, or I am convinced. Because if you say, to me, I believe is the same as I'm convinced. And I do not believe is the same as I am not convinced. That's different from I believe not and I am convinced this isn't true. Where the not goes is important. I do not believe. I do believe not. It's a bad way to speak, but it's clearer that way. That I, in fact, am convinced this is not true versus I am not convinced, in fact, that this is true. Those mean different things. And it reminds me of a joke to end this video on that some of you have heard. Now, obviously, I will explain it. Nah, I won't. So Rene Descartes walks into a bar and the bartender says, would you like a drink? And Rene says, I think not, and promptly disappears. I'll leave you to work that one out philosophically, but thanks everybody. See you next time.